Lecture number 6, Documents of War. So artists' renderings of war often included heroic war heroes and had the goal of arousing patriotic sentiment in the viewers. Artists had both the skills and the imagination at their disposal to create these compositions which would produce very dramatic and heroic effects. Probably the earliest photographic depiction of war is that of the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. The Mexican-American War was an armed military conflict between the United States and Mexico in the wake of the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas. And prior depictions of war, of course, were artists' renderings like the one that we saw on the previous slide of Napoleon in the Alps, as well as the one above here in the Battle of Veracruz. These are images that are typically based on sketches or imaginary scenes. Artists slash journalists were assigned to cover the battles that would be reproduced in newspapers, etc. Again, they could be rendered at their leisure and with creative license for dramatic effect back home in the studio after sketches had been made. The earliest images from this war are not generally images of battle scenes. They're either posed portraits of generals, important soldiers, or scenes that are beyond the realm of the action. So the earliest photographers of war had to rely on existing visual and pictorial conventions since the medium was not yet capable of capturing action scenes. So the Mexican-American War is largely thought of as the very first photographed war, and photos had been primarily cut off from the battle scenes and troop movements, but rather you see images again of individuals, or in this case, you see General Wool and staff coming towards the camera in Saltillo, Mexico. This is one of perhaps 50 images in existence from the Mexican-American War. It's a daguerreotype image of the burial site of the son of Henry Clay. Henry Clay was an American lawyer, politician, and skilled orator who represented Kentucky in the United States Senate and House of Representatives. Other images from this era are simply just moments from the time and place of the war, as we see this daguerreotype of a Mexican family. So we're not seeing any actual depiction of a battlefield or action, but simply the people that were families that were living in the area or perhaps had been displaced. The Crimean War was a conflict fought between Britain, France, against Russia on the Crimean Peninsula. At the time of the author's discussion of this particular war, Crimea was part of Ukraine, and it has often been a disputed territory, is currently been annexed by Russia, but has, again, long been an area of conflict, even today. So this is on the north shores of the Black Sea between and the conflict being between Russia, France, and Britain. Also, Sardinia and Turkey were involved, so quite a number of different interests. The war began as a dispute over the holy places in Palestine and extended into the defense of Christianity within the Ottoman Empire. So what's the significance of the Crimean War? Well, it was largely a very unpopular war in England, and rumors of very poor management and harsh conditions for the troops were rampant, as is depicted in this cartoon. So we see this image saying, well, Jack, here's good news from home. We're to have a medal. That's very kind. Maybe one of these days we'll have a coat to stick it on. So some of the complaints were that the hospital conditions and medical treatment were terrible, that troops did not have enough supplies. And indeed, this is actually the conflict where Florence Nightingale made her name, as she and a team of 38 nurses went into the Crimea to assist in improving the conditions there. So here's an artist's rendition of the action of battle. This is Charge of the Light Brigade, battle at Balaclava. And then here's a photographic image from this conflict. So Roger Fenton is a very well-known photographer in England at the time, and he was commissioned to go to the Crimea and document the conflict. The Crimean Peninsula was a fairly desolate area, had very large stretches of barren landscape, and Fenton had a van or more of a caravan style wagon, portable darkroom that included his 7 cameras, all of his chemistry, 700 plates, and general living supplies. The conditions were fairly harsh, and during the months that he spent there, it was often very bright and too hot. This led Fenton to make exposures very early in the morning, out of necessity, essentially. And many of his images lacked detail because the contrast was far too strong given that very harsh quality of light. If any of you have ever tried photographing images in the desert in the bright sunlight of the daytime, it's very, very difficult to achieve appropriate level of detail. The London Times wrote at the time, "The photographer who follows in the wake of modern armies must be content with conditions of repose and with the still life which remains when the fighting is over." So of course you see, as in this above image, that we're not looking at a battle scene. We're looking at the kind of time in between battles, either early in the morning where you see the troops at rest. Here's an image that shows you the portable darkroom that Roger Fenton used during the Crimean War. And here we see a quiet day at the mortar battery. So again, like lots of images of that have a kind of a quiet feel about them, like either before or after the action, or even possibly posed. So Fenton was actually commissioned to document how the conditions of this war were not as bad as popular sentiment had led people to believe. So he did not photograph a single dead body. Rather, he photographed scenes such as you see above: soldiers resting, a man with a perfectly wrapped, pristine bandage on his head, to report essentially that conditions had improved. This is Fenton's most famous image. It's called The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and it depicts a very desolate road stretching into the distance that's littered with cannonballs. So perhaps these cannonballs were placed in the scene, or perhaps they are remnants of a battle scene. So the photograph was actually made famous in part, perhaps by the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, that was written in 1854 to commemorate the Battle of Balaclava. So this is at the actual site of the battle. And part of the poem reads, "Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600." And this is a line that also comes from Psalm 23:4. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil." So the image itself has been the source of some controversy over the years, primarily over the possible placement of the cannonballs on the road. It's rather a chicken and egg kind of question, actually. So many photographic historians, such as Susan Sontag and Ulrich Keller, assume that the cannonballs were placed on the road for more dramatic effect. And there seems to be a sense of disappointment in this potential staging of the scene. While others, such as the Getty's Gordon Baldwin, who was interviewed by filmmaker Errol Morris, do not believe that this is the case. So one reason he cites is that it was common practice to collect the cannonballs for later use, kind of recycling. And another is, quote, I don't think Fenton has an idea about the symbolic, what later people would say was the symbolic value of the photograph, end quote. To read more about this controversy and the investigations of filmmaker Errol Morris, see the link to the New York Times article that I will provide on Canvas. Fenton left the Crimean War suffering from cholera, as many of the soldiers were. His supporters had hoped that Fenton's images would sell well and help to sway popular opinion about the war, but they did not because the war was over before the images were actually published. However, the images did end up being exhibited at the Royal Watercolor Society in London later in 1855, and they were well received by photographic societies who recognized their importance as historical documents. Fenton's work went on to become a model for a number of American Civil War photographers. And just a couple of other photographers uh, in the world in a similar time period. James Robertson, unlike Fenton, did not shy away from showing scenes of destruction in his photographs. He also photographed the Crimean War, but he has a very different subject matter. He and Fenton are the most well-known photographers of this conflict, though it's not clear that anyone noticed the stark differences between the two. Charles Langlois was a painter and amateur historian before working with photography. His Crimean photographs were used later as a model for a panoramic painting of France's major battles at the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Felice Beato was an Italian-British photographer. He was one of the first Western photographers of East Asia and one of the first war photographers as well. He photographed the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the Second Opium War in China. So now let's start talking about the American Civil War. So economic and political tensions between the North and South in the United States rise to a high point in 1861. This is largely brought on by differing viewpoints on slavery. So the war began in April of 1861. Americans understood that this war would be covered photographically, since they had experienced the widespread popularity of the daguerreotype and portrait photographs over the last couple of decades. So here's an image made by George S. Cook. This was widely published as an engraving and distributed throughout the North. Here we see Major Robert Anderson, who was commander of the federal troops at Fort Sumter. Many soldiers going off to war would have had their portraits taken so that they could leave their families or loved ones with a keepsake of some sort. And conversely, the soldiers also wanted to bring photos with them, photos of loved ones. So portrait studios, such as the ones that you see pictured here in this image, this one was run by the Bergstresser brothers. These kinds of studios popped up at military camps and they capitalized on a new business. So this log cabin photo studio has a really large opening that you can see in the roof that lets in all of the light. So the studio made thousands of portraits following the army around for more than a year. And here's such an image that might be left with a family member or loved one prior to departing for war. Another common technique that was utilized during this time was the ambrotype. This is very similar to what collodion, essentially it is collodion, using a very underexposed glass negative with a black backing behind it creates the positive image when sandwiched in a frame. This image is from the family of Mary Warner Marion, the author of your textbook, and a couple of new techniques arose, including the tintype. This was a lighter weight photographic plate, a sheet of iron, actually not tin, although they did call it a tintype, and this could easily be sent through the mail. The tintype was much less expensive than the daguerreotype, and the ambrotype as well, cost from about 10 to 25 cents a piece. The carte de visite, or calling card, was another format that was used during the Civil War. And we talked about the carte de visite when we talked about André Desideri. And at their height, one company, the E and H.T. Anthony Company, were printing about 1,000 photographs a day that had been sent in by Civil War photographers. Here we see a somewhat casual view of soldiers with a handwritten caption below. So this would have been a carte de visite that one could then add the caption to. Here's an image of a log hut company kitchen from the National Archives. We also see images like this that's in scrapbooks or home photo albums used to keep memorabilia of the war. Photos of troops, newspaper clippings, letters, or stories. And this is a photograph of Matthew Brady's portable darkroom studio cart that was near the battlefields. So Matthew Brady has been considered one of the Civil War's most renowned photographers, but there were over 1,000 different photographers of the American Civil War. Having started an extremely successful portrait studio in New York City, Brady was able to employ a large number of photographers to work for him. He also had a number of contacts with government officials from his notoriety as a portrait photographer, and he was able to gain access to the battlefields very early on in the war. Notable photographers that worked for him initially were Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan. This is perhaps Brady's most famous wartime image. It's unclear exactly who made all of the photographs that were attributed to Brady, since he took the credit for all of those who worked for him. So this is a pretty powerful image. You have the bodies all piled up in neat lines on the battlefield. This is something that hadn't been seen prior to this war. Now take a look at the next image, which was taken by Timothy O'Sullivan, one of Matthew Brady's employees. A very different feel about it. So you have Alexander Gardner, another one of Brady's employees, saying, quote, "This image conveys a useful moral. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to the pageantry," end quote. So this may be in some ways a criticism of Matthew Brady, whose work favored ceremony and personality. Gardner, incidentally, had been working for Brady for a number of years as an accountant and then a photographer, helping to make his business successful. Gardner was a Scot. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1856. During the war, he developed a relationship with Alan Pinkerton, who was also a Scot, who headed the Presidential Protective Service. This is kind of a precursor to the Secret Service. So Brady and Gardner and associates were hired to photograph groups of soldiers, including possible spies. They also copied maps and made pictures of possible battlefields and structures for the War Department. So yet a new use was found for photography. Here's an image by Alexander Gardner. You'll notice that he's given credit for these images, and that is because in 1863, 2 years after the beginning of the war, he left Matthew Brady's employ and went out on his own. He began to work on a large documentary project called A Photographic Sketchbook of the Civil War. So this image by Gardner is rather interesting in that it was largely created by Gardner. He admitted to moving the body and placing its head to face the camera. And he also placed his own rifle in the scene. So the public at the time did not seem to criticize his control over the scene, um, even though they did know about it. So perhaps the concept of photographic truth was less stringent than it became in later years. George Barnard was another former employee of Mathew Brady. He published a book called Photographic Views with Sherman's Campaigns in 1866. In this volume, he recorded the destruction of the Southern railroads by the North. This image, called Sherman's Hairpins, was a document of how troops were ordered to stack the ties and subsequently burn them at high heat so that they couldn't be easily reconstructed. Barnard also documented many of the sites of destruction across the South, as we see here in Charleston. And then after Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, Alexander Gardner was allowed to document the execution of the Lincoln assassination conspirators. This image and others were later published, but were most likely made for Secret Service documents. His work is a precursor to the photo essay of here's a portrait of one of the Lincoln conspirators in his jail cell, David Harold. And here's another one, Lewis Payne. Something so powerful and youth-like about these images of the conspirators. So the overall documentation of the war was the greatest photographic record to date. The photographers of the Civil War petitioned Congress to purchase their negatives and keep them in an archive, mostly unsuccessfully. Mathew Brady was finally able to place his work in a public institution in 1875. And around 90,000 glass negatives made by Gardner were actually destroyed after Congress refused to purchase them, and their safekeeper sold them for scrap. But thousands of images do remain, and a number of them are still in private family collections. As for Mathew Brady, after the war, the public did not desire to collect and see images of the war. They mostly wanted to forget all about it. So sadly, Brady ended up in financial ruin, though he was awarded $25,000 by the government for his unique contribution to historical record. This image sparked controversy over the treatment of prisoners of war. So reports of poor treatment, including starvation of POWs, were coming out of the South, and increasing blockades against the South barred the necessary supplies, which most likely also affected Northern troops that were being held as prisoners of war. The cause of these men's fates is still a debate among historians. A few other wars that I'd like to show you about. In Latin America, in Paraguay specifically, here's a photograph of a battle between Paraguay's Francisco Solano Lopez and the Triple Alliance of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. So this war lasted 6 years and devastated the population of Paraguay. Garcia published his images in Montevideo with U.S. financial backing. Many of the images are similar to that of the American Civil War, in that they are depictions of battle preparations and troop formations. This image, however, is surprisingly active. You have much more of a sense of movement and chaos than many of the other images that we've seen. And here we have the death of Colonel Leon de Paella. Garcia was an Uruguayan and participated in the practice of depicting far more enemy troops dead in general in his photos, which is a universal custom in wartime photojournalism. And in Paris, the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War is a source of photographs during this time. So this is a time in which a group of working class activists and anti-royalists declare themselves the Paris Commune. And though this was a short-lived experience, the group became a symbol of righteous people's revolution. And in 1871, the French government repossessed Paris from the Prussians, and 25,000 Parisians were killed. So this photo documents some of the dead. And we see the communards here posing for photos before and after the tearing down of the Vendôme column that had Napoleon Bonaparte's statue atop it. And here we actually see the communards in their coffins. So although images of corpses in painted depictions of battle scenes was nothing new, photographic images of the dead elicited a very different response. These bodies were not accessories or staged props, they were real. So as Beaumont Newhall says in his History of Photography, quote, "This man lived. This is the spot where he fell. This is how he looked at the very moment when he expired. This is the quality that photography can transmit more strongly than can any other form of picture making." End quote. And here we see an illustration showing a photographer busy amidst the chaos of the battle in Paris. So it expresses the callousness of the photographer, perhaps, or obliviousness. And finally, this is an interesting image. Eugene Appert made a series of composite photographs after the Paris Commune. These images were staged to dramatize certain events and express his anti-commune sentiment. So in Crimes of the Commune, he created images that represented the French government's views about the communards. He hired actors to create historical scenes. In this image, he reenacts the execution of Chaudet, a politician and newspaper mogul, as he exclaims his innocence rather dramatically. So composite printing becomes a popular format in various sensationalist publications in Europe and America. And we'll revisit some war photography as well when we move into the 20th century. And that's it for today's lecture.